So today we will start with the chapter one of Mas-Colell, Winston and Green. We would have a look at preference relation. So preference relation uh, in the preference-based approach, the objectives of the decision maker. You can summarize it by a preference relation, which is denoted by this symbol. So for any two alternatives, x and y, which belong to this set X, we write X. This is called at least as good as. So we write it as X is at least as good as Y. And so this is, we shall see it further. This is called a weak preference relation. And at least as good as, when we say, that includes two possibilities. That is, X is strictly better than Y, or X is exactly as good as Y. So this one, as good as, is a very broad comparison relation from which other relations are derived. Now, why do we start with such a weak preference? Uh, this is because it's the most general comparison relation. Once we know this, we can also derive strict preference relation and indifference. Notice that this is not the same as this. This is at least as good as. This is greater than equal to. Hmm. So once this is known, at least as good as known, we can derive from it the strict preference and indifference. So one primitive relation generates the full ranking structure, and this is convenient because it keeps the framework, first of all, unified. It also allows equal ranking and strict ranking to be handled together, and later we can, from this, it sort of provides a foundation from which we can represent utility and demand analysis. And why does this matter? This matters because microeconomic theory begins with behavior of an individual, and so even a firm, decisions are taken by individuals. So unless and the goods are sold for individuals, the consumers, it's very important to understand how does an individual compare the alternatives and make choices. So preference-based approach answers this by assuming that the decision maker has an underlying ordering over alternatives. This ordering is called preference relation. So first, no, first we already have seen as good as. Now we shall define the strict preference relation. So this is strict preference relation. This is right. So how do we define this? We say that X is strictly preferred to Y if X is at least as good as Y and not the opposite. Right? So then we say that X is at least, X is strictly preferred to Y. So X is at least as good as Y, but Y is not at least as good as X. Therefore, X is generally better than Y, not merely tied with it. So this is called X is preferred to Y. So this relation captures the idea of strict ranking. In also much of the microeconomic theory, the preferences are assumed to be rational. And if this at least as good as, this preference relation, which is called rational, if it satisfies two conditions, that is of completeness and transitivity, right? We shall see what it is, but before that, from the from the indifference, this we can also, from at least as good as, we can also derive indifference. So X is, this is called, X is indifferent to Y. X is indifferent to Y. So uh, by this we mean to say X is at least as good as Y, and Y is at least as good as X. Right? So indifference does not mean the alternatives are physically identical. It just means, they are equally ranked by the decision maker. Uh, and then we can come to completeness and transitivity, which is, that we assume that the preferences are assumed to be rational, and the at least as good as preference relation is called rational if it satisfies these two properties. And so we can now come to completeness. So a preference relation is complete if for all x, y belonging to x. Now this is the set of all possible alternatives. So this is complete if either x is at least as good as y, or y is at least as good as x, or even both. So any two alternatives can be compared, and it is not the case that the decision maker is, completely unable to rank a pair of options. So many possible cases can be there that if X is at least as good as Y, but not, the opposite. So in that case, X is strictly preferred to Y. Opposite can also be there, but not X is Y, and both. So that implies X is indifferent to Y. The only thing we rule out here is the comparability. Then we come to, the meaning and strength of completeness. So completeness says that the decision maker has a well-defined view on every pair of alternatives. Now, this is a really strong assumption because in many real world phenomena, we find that the choices are very difficult to compare. And then some alternatives are unfamiliar or multidimensional, and people can hesitate between different options. For instance, if I give you a choice set comprising 1 year of study abroad versus immediate unemployment, you might not be in a position to, exercise this completeness. You might not be able to compare. So completeness assumes that the individual has reflected enough to form a ranking anyway. In that sense, it treats the decisions as, meditated choices. Then we come to transitivity. So a preference relation is transitive if X is at least as good as Y, Y is at least as good as Z. It implies X is at least as good as Z. So if X is at least as good as Y and Y is at least as good as Z, then X must be at least as good as Z. So it ensures consistency, and without transitivity there can be cyclical. So it ensures that no cyclicality takes place, and then it also ensures stable ranking. So by note on cyclicity, it rules out things like, X is preferred to Y, Y is preferred to Z, and then Z is preferred to X. Such things it rules out. So these things are a problem because in that case optimization becomes, difficult, and best choices may fail to exist. Then the demand